how can we be sure that the election spoken of in Romans 9 is election of the nation of Israel? You've got to keep reading. Let's pick it up here in verse 11. He says, yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand. Time out. Okay. What does the word election mean here? Because there are two kinds of elections in the Bible. There is election to salvation, and I believe in election to salvation, but as I said earlier, we're still freely choosing whether we're going to accept Christ or not. Because by definition, whenever God creates a universe, he knows how it's going to turn out because he's all knowing, right? It's unavoidable for God. Okay. So I believe in election, individual election to salvation, but I don't think it's against our free will. It's in accord with our free will. But there's another kind of election. It's the election of the nation of Israel. And that kind of election took place long before Paul talked about predestination in Ephesians chapter 1. And so if Paul's talking about Israel here, I mean, the very first verse of chapter 9 talks about, what about my brothers? He's talking about Israel right away, right?
Right.
So he says, God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. What shall we say then? Is God unjust? Not at all. Now, this quotation, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, is not from Genesis, it's from Malachi. He's talking about the election of the nation of Israel. And he goes on to say, I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy, compassion on whom I have passion. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. What doesn't depend on man's desire or effort, but God's mercy? God's election of the nation of Israel. How can we be sure that the election spoken of in Romans 9 is election of the nation of Israel? You've got to keep reading. By the time you get to chapter 11, here's what Paul says regarding election. This is verse 28. It says, as far as the gospel is concerned, they, meaning Israel, the Israelites who have not accepted Jesus, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. How can it be, ladies and gentlemen, that it says, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies? How can these people be the elect of God to eternal salvation if they are enemies as far as the gospel is concerned? Can't be. He's bifurcating the gospel and election, in other words, in chapter 11, which is pointing out that election in chapter 9 and chapter 11 is the election of the nation of Israel for God to work through. It is not the election of individuals to salvation. Otherwise, if it was, he wouldn't say, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarch. So that's my short 5-minute overview as to why Romans 9 does not apply to the election of individuals to salvation against their will.